Welcome to Seeds of History, the podcast where we dig deep into the past, planting little seeds of knowledge and watching them sprout into a forest of understanding. I'm your host, Bennett Tanton, and today we're venturing into a chapter of history that's as fascinating as it is underappreciated, the rise of the Iroquois Confederacy. Think of it as the ultimate survival story, where 5, later 6, Native American nations banded together, not just to get along, but to create a society that thrived through centuries of chaos, conflict, and, well, a whole lot of political drama. Now, if you think Game of Thrones had an impressive alliance system, wait until you hear about the Great Law of Peace. It's like a 1,000-year-old masterclass in diplomacy, balancing power, and keeping the peace. You'll see how a bunch of warriors from the northeastern woodlands managed to run one of the most sophisticated political machines North America had ever seen, all while dealing with Europeans who seemed to have an insatiable appetite for land and a knack for, well, complicating things. In this episode, we're going to break down the Confederacy's story into 5 sections, each one peeling back a different layer of how these nations managed to influence everything from trade routes to the very foundation of democracy. But before we dig in, here's a quick nudge. If you enjoy the show, please like, share, and leave us a review. Your feedback is the rain that helps these historical seeds grow. All right, grab your metaphorical moccasins because we're setting off on a journey through the history of the Haudenosaunee, 6 nations that changed the course of history and left a legacy we're still untangling today. Ready? Let's plant some seeds. Imagine, if you will, the northeastern woodlands of North America, endless forests of towering pines, roaring rivers, and land teeming with wildlife. It's beautiful, sure, but also a place where survival wasn't a guarantee. Resources were plentiful, but so were conflicts, especially among the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca nations. They were skilled warriors and expert hunters, but centuries of intertribal warfare left their communities constantly on edge, always preparing for the next raid, the next act of revenge. Blood feuds were a vicious cycle, one that threatened the very existence of these proud nations. Enter a legendary duo, the Great Peacemaker and Hiawatha. Think of them as the ultimate dynamic duo, like Batman and Robin, but with more wisdom and a knack for diplomacy. The Great Peacemaker was a spiritual visionary from the Huron nation, and Hiawatha was an Onondaga chief known for his unmatched oratory skills. Together they set out on a mission that was as bold as it was improbable, to unite these warring tribes under a single peaceful alliance. But here's the twist. Getting 5 nations who had been at each other's throats for generations to put down their weapons and adopt a shared system of governance wasn't exactly an easy pitch. The Peacemaker's ideas were revolutionary even by today's standards. He envisioned a society built on unity, strength through consensus, and a deep respect for the interconnectedness of all things. It's said that his philosophy was deeply rooted in spirituality, emphasizing the idea that peace among people was possible if it was also in harmony with the natural world. Their journey to unify the nations took years and was filled with more setbacks than your average season of Survivor. For one, the Onondaga chief Tadodaho, whose legend paints him as a twisted, serpentine villain, both physically and spiritually, was a massive roadblock. Tadodaho was powerful, feared, and quite committed to the old ways of violence and control. It took every ounce of Hiawatha's diplomatic genius and the peacemaker's spiritual authority to win him over. Legend has it that they physically healed Tedodaho, straightening his body and mind, as a symbolic act to demonstrate the power of unity and healing. Once Tedodaho was convinced, it was as if a key piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The Five Nations finally agreed to the Great Law of Peace, a constitution that laid the groundwork for the Iroquois Confederacy. The peacemaker's vision was solidified in a powerful ceremony during which the warriors symbolically buried their weapons beneath the great tree of peace, an immense white pine whose roots, they believed, spread in all directions to offer protection and shelter to those who would join their alliance. And with that, the Iroquois Confederacy, or Haudenosaunee, was born. What's fascinating is that this wasn't just a peace treaty, it was an entire system of governance. The Great Law of Peace set up a council of 50 chiefs with equal representation for each nation. Decisions were made by consensus, a method that emphasized dialogue and agreement rather than majority rule. Clan mothers, the matriarchal leaders, had the authority to appoint and, if necessary, remove chiefs. It was a system that prioritized balance and the collective good, something that feels, dare I say, pretty progressive even by modern standards. This new alliance turned the Haudenosaunee into a political powerhouse, and their unity transformed the region. Once plagued by endless conflict, these nations now had the strength and stability to defend their territory, manage resources, and become influential players in the fur trade. But, as you might have guessed, peace didn't mean the challenges ended, because soon enough they'd face new threats from the outside world, namely Europeans with ambitions bigger than the Hudson River. So, we've got our five nations unified under this new banner of peace and diplomacy. But how did the Great Law of Peace work in practice? I mean, it's one thing to have a grand vision of unity and quite another to put it into action, especially when you're trying to manage the affairs of 5 different cultures, each with its own traditions and needs. The Great Law of Peace was nothing short of revolutionary, an organic constitution built on the principles of equity, justice, and collective governance. And here's where it gets really interesting. This wasn't just a simple handshake agreement. It was a meticulously structured system that influenced Western democracy centuries later, but more on that in a bit. At the heart of the Great Law of Peace was the Grand Council, composed of 50 chiefs or sachems. These weren't your run-of-the-mill leaders. They were carefully chosen and deeply respected figures, representing each of the 5 founding nations. The Onondaga, being the central firekeepers of the Confederacy, played a unique role, hosting the council meetings and providing spiritual guidance. But here's where it gets even more impressive. Decisions were made by consensus. Yep. All 50 sachems had to agree on matters of war, peace, and policy before any action could be taken. Now you might be thinking, consensus sounds noble, but isn't it a recipe for gridlock? Well, yes and no. It did require intense debate and negotiation, but that was the whole point. The Haudenosaunee believed that a true agreement only came from understanding and accommodating different perspectives. Imagine if our modern governments operated like that. No more 51-49 votes that leave half the people seething. Instead, they aimed for unity, even if it meant long deliberations and plenty of tobacco offerings to the council fire. Another fascinating aspect of the Great Law was its balance of power. It wasn't just a council of old men calling the shots. Enter the clan mothers, the true power behind the throne. These matriarchal leaders had the authority to appoint sachems and could remove them if they failed in their duties. Yes, you heard that right. These powerful women had veto power over the men. The clan mothers ensured that leadership remained accountable and in harmony with the needs of the people. It's as if checks and balances were baked into the system long before Montesquieu and James Madison ever dreamed of the concept. This matrilineal influence wasn't just a cultural quirk. It was a strategic safeguard. Clan mothers prioritized the well-being of future generations, ensuring that decisions weren't made rashly or with short-term gains in mind. The Iroquois Confederacy understood that sustainability and long-term planning were essential for survival. Their leaders weren't politicians who swung with the tides of popular opinion. They were guardians of the people's welfare. But governance wasn't the only thing that made the Great Law unique. It also had a profound spiritual component. The peacemaker taught that peace among people was interconnected with peace in the natural world. As a symbol of this harmony, the white pine, known as the great tree of peace, became a central emblem. The tree's roots, spreading in all directions, represented the unity and inclusivity of the Confederacy. Its branches provided shelter and protection, while the eagle perched on top served as a watchful guardian, ever alert to danger. This spiritual aspect isn't just poetic. It speaks to the Haudenosaunee worldview, where governance wasn't just about politics, but about maintaining balance between human society and the environment. It's a concept that feels almost ahead of its time, like an early precursor to environmental stewardship. And then there were the laws themselves, rules that covered everything from property rights to conflict resolution. Disputes were handled with an emphasis on restoration rather than punishment. The Great Law was about keeping harmony even after mistakes were made. It's hard not to wonder how different our world might be if we had adopted more of these restorative practices. The Great Law of Peace laid the groundwork for a stable society, and the Haudenosaunee thrived under this new system. But peace wasn't something they could take for granted. They were about to face an even greater test as European colonists began to flood into the region, each one bringing not just new goods and technologies, but a whole host of complications. By the early 18th century, the Iroquois Confederacy was already a formidable force in the northeastern woodlands, but its story was far from over. Enter the Tuscarora, an indigenous nation from present-day North Carolina that had its world upended by colonial encroachment, land disputes, and brutal warfare. When the Tuscarora War broke out in the early 1700s, they found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered by European settlers and their allies. It was a devastating conflict that left the Tuscarora people reeling, and they knew they needed a new strategy for survival. The Tuscarora began a northward migration, a journey that must have felt both desperate and hopeful. Imagine traveling hundreds of miles on foot through dense forests and treacherous terrain, carrying not just the physical burdens of your people, but the emotional weight of losing your homeland. Their destination? The Iroquois Confederacy, a beacon of strength and unity in a world that was rapidly changing. When the Tuscarora finally reached the Confederacy, they were welcomed with open arms, though not without some serious deliberation because, well, adding a sixth nation wasn't a casual decision. The Haudenosaunee had to consider the implications carefully. Would the alliance's balance of power be affected? Could they truly trust the newcomers to uphold the Great Law of Peace? It was a question of survival. And in a world full of shifting alliances and unpredictable colonial neighbors, these were not questions to take lightly. Ultimately, the Confederacy saw the strategic and cultural value in accepting the Tuscarora. In 1722, the Tuscarora officially became the sixth nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, marking a significant expansion of this indigenous alliance. The decision wasn't just an act of compassion, it was a smart political move. The addition of the Tuscarora strengthened the Confederacy's position in the ever-evolving power struggle with European colonizers. It added new warriors, new resources, and a new buffer zone of territory that could be crucial in the event of conflict. But integrating the Tuscarora wasn't just about bolstering numbers, it was also about cultural exchange and adaptation. The Tuscarora brought their own traditions, languages, and ways of life, which had to be harmonized with the existing customs of the Haudenosaunee. This blending of cultures speaks to the remarkable adaptability of the Confederacy. It was an alliance that could grow and evolve, a living organism rather than a rigid structure. In many ways, this ability to adapt was a key reason the Confederacy remained resilient in the face of external pressures. And let's not forget the spiritual dimension. The Tuscarora's arrival was seen as a sign that the great tree of peace was still growing, its roots spreading further to provide shelter and protection. It reinforced the belief that unity was a strength, not a weakness. Even as the world around them became more complex and dangerous, the Haudenosaunee commitment to the great law of peace remained unwavering. Of course, the inclusion of the Tuscarora didn't magically solve all of the Confederacy's problems. The 18th century was a turbulent time, with European colonization bringing waves of settlers, new alliances, and conflicts that would test the very foundations of the Haudenosaunee. But with the Tuscarora now part of their ranks, the Confederacy was better prepared to face these challenges. They had new brothers and sisters in the struggle to defend their land, culture, and way of life. As we look ahead, we'll see just how critical this expansion was as the Iroquois Confederacy navigated the treacherous waters of colonial politics. In the next section, we'll explore their diplomatic strategies and how they managed to play European powers against each other, all while maintaining their own sovereignty, at least for a time. All right, buckle up, because now we're diving into the diplomatic arena, where the Iroquois Confederacy wasn't just a regional powerhouse, they were the grandmasters of political strategy. You've probably heard of European nations scrambling to carve up North America like a Thanksgiving turkey, right? Well, while the British, French, and Dutch were scheming, the Haudenosaunee were playing a game of geopolitical chess that would make even the sharpest modern-day diplomats nod in respect. Picture this. It's the 17th and 18th centuries, and the New World is the ultimate land grab. European powers are jostling for dominance, and every colonial governor seems to have dreams of empire. The Iroquois Confederacy found itself smack in the middle of this chaos, but instead of being crushed or overwhelmed, they saw opportunity. They played a strategy known as the Covenant Chain, a series of treaties and alliances that allowed them to manipulate European rivalries to their advantage. They'd strike deals with the British one day and then play nice with the French the next, always keeping their options open and their enemies guessing. Take, for instance, the fur trade. The Haudenosaunee understood that fur wasn't just a commodity, it was leverage. By controlling trade routes and access to valuable beaver pelts, They held the keys to an economic empire that stretched across the continent. European traders needed Iroquois cooperation if they wanted a slice of the lucrative fur trade, and the Confederacy made sure to extract every ounce of benefit from these arrangements. They were economic power brokers, using their influence to secure weapons, goods, and strategic alliances. But it wasn't just about trade, it was about survival. The Confederacy's leaders knew that aligning too closely with any one European power could spell disaster. If they put all their beaver pelts in one basket, so to speak, they risked being swallowed up in the relentless European power struggles. So, they mastered the art of balance. They'd agreed to support the British against the French in one conflict, only to negotiate a separate peace with the French later. This wasn't betrayal, it was survival through shrewd and calculated diplomacy. One of the most famous examples of Iroquois diplomatic acumen was during the Beaver Wars, a series of conflicts in the 17th century where the Confederacy expanded its territory and influence at the expense of rival tribes and European powers. They emerged from these wars with new lands, a stronger alliance, and even greater influence. It was like a centuries-long power play, and the Haudenosaunee came out on top. But with great power comes, well, even greater complications. As the 18th century rolled on, colonial tensions heated up, and the Confederacy had to make increasingly difficult choices. The French and Indian War, 1754-1763, was a prime example. The Haudenosaunee initially tried to maintain neutrality, but when it became clear that neutrality wasn't an option, they sided cautiously with the British. It was a gamble, one that paid off in the short term but would come with consequences as British dominance grew. The Iroquois Confederacy's role as a diplomatic powerhouse can't be overstated. They negotiated treaties with precision, always aiming to protect their lands and sovereignty. Yet, the colonial landscape kept shifting, and the Confederacy had to adapt constantly. Their leaders, like the brilliant Mohawk diplomat Joseph Brant, played a crucial role in these negotiations, often walking a tightrope between appeasing European interests and safeguarding their people's future. And then there were the Covenant Chain Treaties, a brilliant series of agreements with the British that both parties claimed to uphold, though not always with the same level of enthusiasm. The Haudenosaunee used these treaties to establish a framework for peace and trade, all while ensuring that European encroachment didn't go unchecked. It was a delicate dance, one that required relentless vigilance and a deep understanding of both indigenous and European political dynamics. However, as the American Revolution loomed on the horizon, the Confederacy's diplomatic tightrope act became even more perilous. They would soon be forced to make impossible choices, with alliances fracturing and old strategies tested to their breaking point. But that's a story for the next section. As the 18th century rolled into the 1770s, the American Revolution became the defining conflict of the era, and the Iroquois Confederacy found itself in the most precarious position yet. The old strategies of playing European powers off each other began to falter as the colonies took up arms against British rule. Suddenly, the Haudenosaunee were faced with a civil war that threatened to pull them apart from within. The question of which side to support wasn't just a political or military decision, it was existential. Now, remember the Iroquois system of governance we discussed earlier. the one built on consensus? Well, the revolution fractured that unity. Some nations, like the Mohawk and Seneca, aligned with the British, believing that the crown was their best hope for stopping further American expansion into Iroquois lands. After all, the British had made promises, however empty they sometimes seemed, about honoring territorial boundaries. The Oneida and Tuscarora, on the other hand, sided with the American revolutionaries. They had built strong ties with colonial settlers and believed that an American victory might give them a chance at a more stable future. And there it was, a painful split right down the middle of the Confederacy. For a political system founded on the great law of peace, this internal division was a devastating blow. Imagine being a nation built on unity, now forced to fight not just against outsiders, but also alongside them against your own brothers. The American Revolution wasn't just a war between colonial forces. It was a war that tore at the very fabric of Haudenosaunee society. The battles that followed were brutal. One of the most infamous campaigns was led by the American general John Sullivan in 1779. Sullivan's army, under orders from George Washington, launched a scorched earth campaign against the Iroquois nations that had sided with the British. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and entire communities displaced. It was a catastrophic loss for the Haudenosaunee, who had already suffered years of hardship and attrition. The once mighty Confederacy was now in shambles, their people scattered, their land ravaged. When the dust finally settled and the American Revolution ended, the Iroquois were left in an almost unimaginable situation. The British, their supposed allies, had lost, and the Treaty of Paris in 1783 did nothing to address the fate of the Haudenosaunee. The Americans, now independent and hungry for land, saw little need to honor old agreements or protect Iroquois territories. The Confederacy, weakened and divided, faced relentless pressure from westward expansion, and there was little they could do to stop it. But here's where the story takes a turn, not for the better, but for the resilient. Despite the loss of land and influence, the Haudenosaunee did not vanish into history as a forgotten people. They adapted, fought for their rights, and found ways to preserve their culture and heritage. Leaders like Joseph Brant, a Mohawk war chief and diplomat, worked tirelessly to secure land for their people and negotiate for their survival. The Confederacy may have been politically weakened, but culturally and spiritually, the Haudenosaunee endured. Over the following centuries, the legacy of the Iroquois Confederacy continued to influence both native and non-native societies. Their governance system, with its emphasis on consensus and balance, is often cited as an inspiration for American democratic ideals, though this influence is still debated among historians. And their teachings on environmental stewardship and the interconnectedness of all life resonate deeply, perhaps even more so today as we grapple with global environmental challenges. The Confederacy story is one of profound resilience, of a people who faced unimaginable loss yet never surrendered their identity or vision of peace. The great law of peace still guides the Haudenosaunee, a testament to the enduring strength of their principles. Today, the Iroquois continue to fight for their rights, their lands, and the acknowledgement of their place in history, not just as relics of the past, but as living nations with a vibrant present and future. So, as we reflect on this journey from the rise of a groundbreaking alliance to its struggles and perseverance, it's clear that the seeds planted by the great peacemaker and Hiawatha have continued to grow. The branches of the great tree of peace still reach for the sky, even if the landscape around it has changed forever. that's a wrap on today's episode of Seeds of History. We've traversed centuries of conflict, diplomacy, and resilience, all centered around the incredible story of the Iroquois Confederacy, from the visionary leadership of the great peacemaker and Hiawatha to the calculated diplomacy that kept European powers in check, and finally, to the immense trials of the American Revolution. The Haudenosaunee have shown us that history is never just a series of isolated events. It's a continuous story where the past echoes into the present. Reflecting on their legacy, it's hard not to feel inspired. The Iroquois Confederacy wasn't perfect, but it was a testament to human ingenuity, cooperation, and the will to find common ground in the face of chaos. Even today, their influence lingers, reminding us that systems of governance can be built on principles of balance, inclusivity, and respect for the natural world. We do well to remember that. Before you go, if you enjoyed this episode, please consider liking, sharing, and leaving a review. Your support is what keeps this podcast thriving, and it's always a joy to know that these seeds of history are taking root in curious minds like yours. And if you have suggestions for future episodes or just want to share your thoughts, don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you for joining me on this historical dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and never stop planting seeds of knowledge.